away we go.
Shining star for you to see what your life can truly be.
What does New York in the 1970s mean to you when you first think of those words?
Well, the first time I came, I think it was in 91, and it hadn't changed much. It still was, Times Square was still Times Square. It hadn't been taken over by Disney. 42nd Street was still ratchet as hell. The Bronx and Harlem still had bombed out buildings because I started my music video career there, kind of. And then there's those favorite films like Taxi Driver and French Connection. And I even love Saturday Night Fever because I think too many people give attention to it being a disco movie when it's actually a real hardcore kind of independent movie if you look at it and its themes and how raw it is. And then there's my favorite movie of all time, which is 1969's Midnight Cowboy, which really paints a particular picture of New York. So you take all those, and my whole goal was to have an impressionistic take of some random year in the late 70s because I wanted to borrow music from disco, which goes later in the 70s. And originally the series took place in like 1975, but I wasn't able to draw from post-75. So it's that with like different style of lighting and being inspired by noir films, but like disco, that word disco, and then I put disco noir together, and I go, well, what does disco mean to people? It means expression, freedom, a wild night out, a whole lot of adjectives you can describe for disco. And yes, Saturday Night Fever is the most popular movie, but it doesn't necessarily mean the movie's a disco movie. I just put disco noir together as a way in for me, and also the playfulness, a kind of camp element that runs through the Wick films, and I think people forget that sometimes. And when you look back in the Wick films, they have a sense of humor, they have a sense of camp, and they're not taking themselves too seriously. And I think the audience have a good time with it.
Do you see some of the New York you found in the early 90s in the New York you created for this series?
Well, the one thing is they talked about this sanitation strike that happened during the 70s where the trash was piled like 6 foot high. It was pretty trashy when I came in 91. It wasn't that clean, you know, and there was something very tactile and real about it and rough and rugged. And, you know, New Yorkers have always been known to kind of go with the flow, and they're tough people. They don't take no shit. So you still saw that attitude that you see in Taxi Driver in 91. And it's amazing because the year 2000 was 23 years ago. It was a blink of an eye to me, right? So 1991, I'm 19. I have no perspective on it. It's a blink of an eye to be in the 70s. 20 years is not that big of a difference, basically, right? We did modernize a bit, but we didn't have iPhones or the internet, really. And so people were still very much eye contact and dealing with each other. And I think that's the only big difference. But there was a lot to draw from because I did go up and shoot a few hip-hop music videos in the Bronx and Harlem and get to feel what's that movie, Fort Apache, The Bronx? You remember that one? Yeah, that was hardcore.
Well, you mentioned the Wick films a minute ago, and one of the things, since we're talking about aesthetics, I notice when I think of the John Wick films, I think, you know, very slick color palettes, you know, lots of glass, lots of neon. Yep. And this show, to me, it seems a little warmer, but, you know, maybe a little more earthy, a little seedier.
A little murkier.
Yeah, and that was a conscious choice then.
Yeah, and I think I've seen people say various things on it, and it's like the thing I say to that is like John Wick is a modern film with modern equipment, with modern lighting, with modern design. You know, if you go back in time, sure you have neon. I didn't want to lean into neon because that's what Wick does so well, and we had to cut our own path because of the time period, basically. And they're also using sharp, very, very sharp lenses. We use lenses that were made in the 1950 for MGM and Pathé may have made them, a few of them. And they shot such films as Cool Hand Luke, The Graduate, and Dr. Zhivago. So they have a lot of anomalies and aberrations. They're not perfect lenses. They're very heavy. And I've used them before, but they have this specific textural quality that lends itself to taking the sharpness off of digital capture. And the last thing I also want to do is like, even though people may say they want it, they don't. You can't copy Chad Stahelski and Keanu and give them the exact same thing they saw. That would be doing a disservice to the universe, right? You look at Noel Hawley and Fargo or Tony Gilroy and Andor or Jon Favreau and Mandalorian, they're not doing the same things. You can't survive copying what's been established by those guys, that they do it so well. And I think that would be a big mistake. But again, it's the 70s, so you want to reverse engineer and kind of retrograde the image.
Related to that, it is the 70s, and we've said, it is literally a dirtier time with a sanitation strike. Do you think the Continental Hotel is a more dangerous place in this series?
I think it's definitely a more dangerous place because the guy running it, Cormac, doesn't have all his marbles together, And when you talk about Wick lore and mythology and rules, let's say, right, or the code they live by, they're constantly broken in all the films, right? No one's really following the rules. The codes are set up as a kind of a story device, right? So if you go back in time 40 years, maybe they developed some of the rules because of Cormac. Like in our hotel, or you'll see also in the third episode how that red light turning on plays into it. Some people go, whoa, the red light, what does that mean? There's no killing in hotel grounds in the Wick films. And it's like, yeah, there's still no killing in the hotel grounds, but they had this thing installed because they have this sociopathic guy in there who, if somebody does something to him or the hotel, you can turn it on and say, kill that person. You can now do business for this finite period of time. And when the light goes off, you can't kill anymore. If we found the guy who stole something or something else happened in the hotel that was untoward towards the hotel, the high table, or Cormac.
Well, I mean, I just in the first episode, I was taken by surprise in a good way by how much security with armed guards there were at the Donna summer party. Understandably so, because then a lot of killing breaks out. And I wanted, there's some really great tracking shots in that sequence, and I wanted to ask you how you planned that.
Well, it started with the writer and showrunner Kirk Ward had written this very simple. Well, he wrote that was his baby, the whole intro before the main titles, and he wrote this very simple sentence like Frankie walks through the party, the New Year's party, and meets Cormac, and then the dialogue starts. And then a filmmaker or director's job is to look at something like that as an opportunity. Like, oh my God, it's New Year's, it's 19 whatever. Donna Summer or whoever, then you start pulling in other elements and the shot starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger because no one's saying, no, you can't do that. And a producer that I brought on, Marshall Persinger, who had worked on The Alienist a couple years before in Budapest, goes, there's this wonderful animal trainer out there who has monkeys and this and that. I go, he has monkeys, huh? So then once she told me about the monkey, I was like, I need a monkey. Then it turned into a horse and Lady Godiva and kind of Bianca Jagger throwback to Studio 54. And it becomes about setting up the tone and the environment and geography for the audience, even though you're misdirecting them in a way, because later you see Frankie leaves and you go, what's going on here? Then he comes back in a different way. And you don't yet realize what he's doing until it's revealed what's going up on the floor above him, basically, right? So there's a lot of reasons for it. Geography, nostalgia, you place the needle drop, the audiences put themselves in the time period. And then you also want to have this more leisurely pace in a way where you're lulling them to sleep because something's really about to jump off. And so it's all those things, But it starts with the script, and there was that kernel of an idea of, a New Year's Eve party in New York in the late 70s. Wow, it's not like, I don't know, Kansas.
I know in the movies they pulled a lot from Hong Kong and other Eastern martial arts cinema. Would you say you're pulling from a wider net for your action influences in this?
Oh, yeah. I had a friend contact me on Facebook Messenger last night. He was a good friend from high school. It was one of my first movies. He didn't know I directed it. And he's like, I had to go back. He goes, I could tell that was your style. And it reminded me of when we used to watch all those John Woo movies. And I'm like, yeah, that's where Chad gets it from, too. We were heavily into those John Woo, Hard Boiled, The Killer, and all those things, right? But my influences come from everything now because I'm 51 now. And they can come from a dog food commercial, it can come from a silly TikTok video. I just got TikTok because of my daughter. I hate that thing. It's too, whatever. It's like ADD. But also, your part of your market has attention problems, It comes from living in Europe, too. I've been watching a lot of European cinema and dealing with a lot of European crew. And they have a different flavor than the Americans do. They're not so kind of finite and traditional and just into American film history. In this series, the Americans won't see it. You will because you know film, but a lot of the general market won't know that a lot of these shots and flavors are totally from European films, and of course American films that we all love. But I'm not a snob when it comes to inspiration, or as you've heard a variation of this. There's a fine line between like thievery and inspiration, right? Spielberg will talk about it. Scorsese will talk about it. And it's not about like stealing someone's shot. It's about you're really turned on by something Fellini did or Hitchcock did or some of these Czech filmmakers I really love or Polish filmmakers I really love and the way they see the world. And it comes through you. It shouldn't come through you intellectually. It should come through your creative side, which is your gut. And you're just collecting all this stuff through your life. And sometimes it comes out and you're like, wow, I really like that. I wonder where that came from. And then a week later, I'll see a film and I go, oh, that's where that came from.
An older influence I thought I saw was when Winston and Frankie as young as brothers. And I was thinking Angels with Dirty Faces.
You're talking about the noir age, which Criterion has a whole section on, right? And this, again, is where I'm kind of silly, okay? So I have that, and then there's another noir site I go into, right? And I'll play them in the background sometimes with no sound. And then when I see something I like, I write down the title. And I go, I have to double, and it's a long list now, right? I go, I have to double back and now watch that with sound because I constantly have them playing as screensavers. Even when I'm in Budapest working on this, there's screensaver movies playing in the background as I'm working. But in Prague, sometimes I'm laying in bed and I just play it because I'm on a phone call or I'm editing or doing something else. And I see because I recognize the title, but I go, I bet you I've seen it, I know it, I've heard it. But because I'm buried under so much content, like constantly, it's like Pink Floyd with me. Like I love Pink Floyd, and I love like 15 songs in particular, but I can't tell you the titles because I wasn't an album collector. I wasn't there studying the title. I do know like Comfortably Numb and In the Flesh, and there's certain songs I know from them that I really, really love. But for the most part, my favorites, I don't know the titles.
I did want to bring up the casting in this series because, for example, it's so on point, and I was curious when it comes to casting a young Winston, are you looking for literally someone who could be a young Ian McShane, or is there something more intangible or ephemeral that Colin brings to it?
It's a little bit of both, but you don't want to lean too heavy on the superficial, which is the looks. You want the audience not to be bumped by if he doesn't look like him, so you have to get that business out of the way. And then it's about talent. And I had no idea I knew he was talented just by his audition, but I didn't know how much of a thinking actor he is. He's constantly thinking what's before, what's after, studying Ian McShane's mannerisms, because you don't want an imitation. You just want this impression of him, and people take that word impression as imitation. It's not the same thing. It's an impression of a swag, an attitude, a delivery, an aura, basically. I think that's more it. And I had no idea until I started working with him. I'm like, oh my God, this he's a knockout. And he has all these kind of intangibles, like the camera loves him, and that's something you're born with. You can't learn that. Sometimes I'll see people off camera and I go, oh, what's so special about them? And then once that cinema lens hits them, they have an instant relationship. So that gets you halfway there with the audience. Like Denzel has that. Harrison Ford has it. Look at Javier Bardem. He's a beautiful man on camera, a beautifully interesting man. Off camera, you're like, how does this work? It's some chemical thing going. I don't know what it is. So he had all the stuff in spades, and to me, he's a throwback movie star. And I did look at the old pictures of both Ian McShane and Lance Reddick, and it's surprising how similar Colin is to Ian McShane.
Another bit of casting I want to bring up is Mel Gibson, who is, excellent in these episodes. But does an actor's off-screen history or perception even of their history ever influence you in the casting process?
I would say in this case, it was about getting the best guy for the role. And me loving Road Warrior, and that was one of my favorites. And any time in casting, it's about trying to get the best person for the role. And I leave it to the audience to decide how well he did for the part, but I think they'll understand why the casting choice was made once they see it and how wild it goes. And he does a good job of playing, if you look at the roles from the past, like he does a really good job of playing passionate characters that you believe. And there's a whole handful of actors I can point to that do this for me. Tom Cruise is one of them. Tom Hardy's one of them, where you believe them in the role. You believe they're believing the world. And we really needed that, even though we are leaning into, you'll see in the third episode, we're leaning heavy camp. And we're all having fun with it. But when you get to the third episode, it kind of like really goes off the rails, because I think it's a mistake for people to go in thinking it's a serious drama. There is a serious dramatic story that's undergirding everything, but it's there as a pure escapism and entertainment, and it's what I drew from the Wick world, was this kind of, it feels like a parallel universe, like the subculture of assassins. Like it's a ridiculous concept at face value, but somehow you just go with it.
It is a camp. It is a ridiculous world. But it's also, to me, there's an authenticity to it, and the way you especially develop in this series. It's a closed society with its own rules and taboos and consequences. And it does, in that way, remind me a lot of your earlier work. Is that something that you've been drawn to, you think?
No, it's interesting because I had to retrain my brain, because the Wick world doesn't want social realities, or common issue of today or yesterday, like, let's say, realistic gun violence in the inner city, or generational trauma, slavery, politics, all those trigger issues that were big back then and now. It doesn't want it. And I've been trained to go for reality. So I would study like homicide photos, crime, deep dive on what happens in this city. Like Dead Presidents, it's one thing. It's Vietnam and post-Vietnam. A Menace, it's inner city violence with kids. On this, when I was trying to bring in some things from New York from the 70s, like the blackout, I think it was a summer blackout, Summer of Sam, the mayoral race with Ed Koch, and I forgot the short guy he beat. It just kept kicking it out. And I was happy it did, because that's the big difference. They may have the commonality of like, oh, they deal in violence, but one is fantasy violence and one is more grounded violence. Now, the closest thing that comes to this for me in my past with Book of Eli, because it had a more fantastical element to it, but it was grounded. I wouldn't say the John Wick films are grounded at all.
I guess I was referring to, like, when I think of, in this regard, a Menace to Society, or even American Pimp, where in cultures where there are strict rules and observations.
Subcultures that have, yeah, you're correct, totally correct. And it's usually it's dealing with the underclass or so-called minorities or something like that. Where the Wick world, it's a spectrum of everybody, and it's kind of racially and gender neutral, which is what's special about the world. They don't care if you're a man or woman. There's a shootout that's going to jump off, and it's going to be fun. A woman can kick a man's ass, like, no problem. Nobody's raising an eyebrow like, well, she's a little smaller. Well, she's more skilled. In that world, she's more skilled. Those are the things I haven't dealt with. Now, the things that are common in a way is like, yes, I've dealt with the Vietnam theme that's subtly or not so subtly put into this series, right? There are some nods to culture, like cultural differences and joking ways. Even the line about the cravat, the difference between the cravat and an ascot.
How are we supposed to believe a guy in an ascot can pull this off? It's a cravat.
It's a very cultural thing. It's the first time the Americans have gotten the word right. It is an ascot, and the Brits are wrong. A cravat is actually the umbrella term for any menswear, neckwear. A tie, a bow tie, a scarf, a handkerchief, it doesn't matter. The cravat is the umbrella term. And the interesting thing about the word is I had to do a deep dive on that, is it came from Croatian mercenaries. They'd wear a scarf around their neck, and I believe it was the French that gave them that name, cravat. It was a different version of cravat the French came up with, but it was based on the mercenaries. And then this umbrella term was developed that the British think they're right about, but they're not. I'm sorry.
They always do. That's not.
But it's the first time the Americans are right about a word. Like, no, it's an ascot.
I did just want to say, obviously, I am a fan of so much of your early work, and Menace to Society specifically is such a really influential classic. And I'm curious, it does feel like the tools of filmmaking have been much more democratized. But do you feel it's harder for a movie like that to find a wider platform to get people to see it?
Yeah, it's the game. I mean, there's so many things you can talk about, whether it's YouTube, streaming. It's been democratized by, look at the camera we're looking at right now. Like 10 years ago, that would be 5 times the size. But when I was growing up, there's a video camera, a big one, And these pieces of equipment are inexpensive now. It's all about the cream rising to the top. But the problem with today is that there's so much noise. How do you cut through it? And a movie like Menace could have been made today. Like take Moonlight, for instance. It's not a version of Menace, but it's a version of a small film of a culture that made it. Back then, we had several independent companies, including someone who's in jail right now who was championing and pioneering stuff like that. And you had New Line Cinema, and you had several others. They're all falling by the wayside, I think, because the theater chains are full of IPs, tentpoles, and Marvel movies. And now adult fare or dangerous little movies are going online and streaming, and even then they get buried. Look at Netflix's algorithm. Like, they spend all this money in programming, and it comes in one week, it's out the next, and you have to kind of dig to find it. It's a strange time to live in, but I always believe that the talent will rise to the top, and there's such little talent in any field. There's a finite number of probably 10% of the 100 that are really talented, and the 90% of the jokers below them are the ones doing most of the work because there's not enough talent to go around. So, and it explains why some of these movies, like, you can be a talented person and make a bad movie, okay? It happens all the time. Or you can be an untalented person and actually fuck around and make a good movie because you have the right producer, the right writer, the right script. So it's just a strange game of like chemistry, timing, luck, opportunity. You could never predict, because if somebody could figure out the cheat code, they would have. And Spielberg's one of the closest to do it. He's like hitting 75%.
I could talk to you for probably another half hour, but Albert, it was a real pleasure for you to come in here.
Oh, thank you guys for having me, because I enjoy your operation. I was there in Comic-Con, and I've been keeping an eye on you guys for years because I live in Prague and I'm online a lot, so I get my culture and film stuff from people like you.